Hi everyone, this is Mrs. Josephine F. Loresca, and here's another virtual learning session in Creative Writing. Today, we will follow the footsteps of these famous writers who created masterpieces for the world to enjoy. Let us now explore the wonders of verses and discover how powerful emotions turn into beautiful works. So what is our most essential learning competency for today? It's to identify the various elements, techniques, and literary devices in specific forms of poetry. That is for Quarter 1, Weeks 3 and 4, from October 5 to October 19. It's time for poetry, its elements and forms. For today's virtual learning session, we will have the following topics: definitions of poetry, elements of poetry, and forms of poetry. We begin our lesson by quoting Thomas Hardy. He said, "Poetry is emotion put into measure. The emotion must come by nature, but the measure can be acquired by art." This quote from Hardy only explains how condensed poetry is, but intense and powered with so much emotion. That would lead us to the definition of poetry given by Wordsworth. He said, "It is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility." In a poem, the natural outburst of emotion is evident, which, like the definition states, is creatively expressed into words amidst silence. Therefore, do some reflection in a place that will motivate you to bring out the poet in you, just like this, in silence, enjoying the calmness and serenity of the place. Now let us have the other definitions of poetry. First, it is arranged in lines. Next, it is more suggestive than prose. And it is more descriptive in nature, and it is written in a more condensed language, stylized syntax, and figures of speech not found in ordinary communication. Here are the distinguishing characteristics of poetry. Poetry has a speaker. Unlike prose, which has a narrator, poetry has a speaker. A speaker, or voice, talks to the reader. The speaker is not necessarily the poet. It can also be a fictional person, an animal, or even a thing. Here is an example. "But believe me, son, I want to be what I used to be when I was like you," by Gabrielle O'Cara. Another distinguishing characteristic of poetry is this: poetry is also formatted differently from prose. It is composed of lines and stanzas. A line is a word or row of words that may or may not form a complete sentence, while a stanza is a group of lines forming a unit. The stanzas in a poem are separated by a space. Check this poem written by Robert Frost. How many lines are there per stanza? Yes, it's 5. Correct. Now, how many stanzas are there? 4. You're correct. Good job. Now, why is this so? This is one example of a line. And if you group them all together, then that's a stanza. We shall now have the elements of poetry: theme, tone, voice, stanza, sound, rhythm, and figures of speech. Let's start with theme. Theme is the central idea or message in a poem. It should not be confused with subject or what the work is about. Rather, theme is a perception about life or human nature shared with the reader. Number 2. Tone. It is the attitude a writer takes toward the subject. The language and details a writer chooses help to create a tone which might be playful, serious, bitter, angry, or detached, among other possibilities. Unlike mood, which refers to the emotional response of the reader to a work, tone reflects the feelings of the writer. Number 3. Voice. It is a word people use to talk about the way poems talk to the reader. Number 4. Stanza. It is a group of lines that form a unit of poetry. The stanza is roughly comparable to the paragraph in prose. In traditional poems, the stanzas have the same number of lines and often have the same rhyme scheme and meter as well. The most commonly used stanza forms are the following: couplet, terza rima, quatrain, quinton, sestet, rime real, ottava rima, spenserian, and the sonnet. Let's start with the couplet. It is composed of 2 successive lines. Terza rima is a 3-line stanza. Quatrain is composed of lines of 4. Quinton is composed of 5 lines per stanza, while a sestet is a stanza of 6 lines. Rime real is a 7-line stanza, also called septet. Ottava rima is an 8-line stanza, also called octave, while a spenserian stanza is a 9-line poem, and finally, a sonnet that has 14 lines. Moving on to the 5th element of poetry, sound. Poets use a variety of techniques to produce special qualities of sound. One of the most important things poems do is play with the sound. One of these techniques is the use of figures of speech that create sound and melody, like alliteration, assonance, consonants, and onomatopoeia. Next, number 6. Rhythm. This refers to the pattern of beat of stressed and unstressed syllables in a line of poetry. Poets use rhythm to bring out the musical quality of language, to emphasize ideas, to create mood, and to reinforce the subject matter. And finally, figures of speech, which was discussed in the previous lesson. It is a language that communicates ideas beyond the literal meanings of the words. It stimulates vivid pictures or concepts in the mind of the reader. Now let's move on to the elements of conventional poems. Now, what is a conventional poem? It is a type of poem that contains regular patterns of rhyme and rhythm. What are its elements? We have meter, rhyme, and caesura. Starting off with meter. Meter is the repetition of a regular rhythmic unit in a line of poetry. The meter of a poem is like the beat of a song that establishes a predictable means of emphasis. Each unit of meter is known as a foot, a rhythmic pattern determined by the relationship between the stressed, accented, or strong syllables and the unstressed, unaccented, or the weak syllables. Let us now have the 4 basic types of metrical feet: the iamb, the trochee, anapest, and dactyl. Iamb is an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable, while a trochee is a stressed syllable followed by an unstressed syllable. Let's move on to the second set. Unstressed refers to two unstressed syllables followed by a stressed syllable, while a dactyl is a stressed syllable followed by the two unstressed syllables. Now, how do we use this? Consider I am. When you say light, it means unaccented. When you say heavy, it is accented. In beat, you say the doom. Now let's do this in words. In haste. Now let's try it on group of words. She never saw a purple cow. See how we divide the line per two syllables? Each group contains unstressed and stressed syllables. Let us now have the next element of a conventional poem. Rhyme. Words rhyme when the sound of their accented vowels and all the succeeding sounds are identical. Sometimes rhymes are exact, other times they are just similar. Here are the two kinds of rhyme: internal rhyme and end rhyme. Internal rhyme occurs when the rhyming words appear in the same line, while end rhyme occurs when the rhyming words come at the end of the lines. And that would give us rhyme scheme. Rhyme scheme is the pattern in which sounds in lines of poetry end. Let's have an example. Look at this excerpt of Robert Frost's poem entitled Stopping by the Woods on a Snowy Evening. Underline the last word in every line. Then each new sound in the poem is assigned a different letter. Since no, though, snow rhyme together, they are assigned the same letter, which is A. Then the word here does not rhyme with any of the underlined words, therefore it is given a B. That makes this stanza an AABA pattern. And finally, Caesura. It is a strong pause within a line and often found alongside an enjambment. If all the pauses in the sense of the poem were to occur at the line breaks, this could become dull. Moving the pauses so they occur within the line creates a musical interest. Now, what is an enjambment? In poetry, this means that a thought steps over at the end of the line and into the beginning of the next line with no punctuation. It is when the end of a phrase extends past the end of a line. Here is an example of enjambment and Caesura in Browning's poem If Thou Must Love Me. This is the enjambment, and these are the samples of Caesura. Now let's move on to the different forms of poetry. In conventional poems, we have haiku, tanaga, jona, and sonnet. And for non-conventional poems, we have free verse, concrete, and acrostic. Let's start with the different forms of poetry in conventional poem. Haiku. It is a very short form of Japanese poetry consisting of 3 lines of 5, 7, 5 syllables respectively. Here is an example. A caterpillar. Inside the cocoon, it sleeps. Awakens, it flies. Count the number of syllables per line. For the first line, we have 5 syllables. For the second line, we have 7 syllables. And for the third line, again we have 5 syllables. Here is another example written by Alpha Jaira Bugarin, one of my grade 12 songs last year. Beam of sunlight fades, duskiness sights in heavens, a new dawn, it shines. Next is Tanaga. It is a poem consisting of 4 lines with 7 syllables each, with the same rhyme at the end of each line. Here is an example. I will never be a mess, as long as I do my best, and my God will do the rest for my beautiful success. Written by Ferialin Parcon, one of the grade 12 Psalms 2 years ago. Each line is composed of 7 syllables. Let us have the third one, Jonah. It is a poem consisting of 3 lines with 7 syllables each. Here is an example. Written by Art Ribamontan, one of the grade 12 Psalms 2 years ago. O visible in their sight, no shelter suffer at night, and seeing justice make it right. Again, each line has 7 syllables. And finally, a sonnet. It is a poetic form which is composed of 14 lines and traditionally follows a strict rhyme scheme and specific structure. Let us use one of Shakespeare's sonnets as our example, Sonnet 116. This sonnet has 14 lines, each with 10 syllables. It strictly adheres to ABAB pattern but ends on a couplet. For literary enthusiasts, they know that all of Shakespeare's sonnets are technically iambic pentameter. We shall now have the different forms of poetry for non-conventional poems. Let's start with free verse. Free verse poetry does not have any repeating patterns of stressed and unstressed syllables. It does not have rhyme. It is very conversational, sounds like someone is talking with you. It is a more modern type of poetry. Next is acrostic. It is a type of poem in which the first letter, syllable, or word of each line, paragraph, or other recurring feature in the text spells out a word or a message. Here is an example. Cross, written by Marvin Angelo Bulyagay, one of my grade 12 Psalms last year. Note that the initial letters of his lines spells out a word. And finally, concrete. It is also called shape poetry. It is a poetry whose visual appearance matches the topic of the poem. The word form shapes which illustrate the poem's subject as a picture, as well as through their literal meaning. Here is an example. Magnificence, written by Art Ribamontan. So that ends our session for today. Again, this is Mrs. Loresca. Until our next meeting.